Okay, so we've stated that there are alternatives to critical thinking. Uh, jumping to the first conclusion that you reach, and going with precedent. If what your ancestors did was unworkably horrible, they probably wouldn't have survived and reproduced, and we wouldn't be here to ask. If what your neighbors were doing is so amazingly horrible, they'd probably have failed and starved to death, and they wouldn't be there for you to copy. So, just going with the first conclusion that you reach and copying precedent sort of works. Maybe it doesn't work well enough for us picky critical thinkers, but sometimes it does work well enough for survival. And that kind of action is what was normal for almost all of animal history and almost all of human history until very recently. Only about 2,500 years ago, maybe 3,000, was philosophy invented. And what is philosophy? Deciding how to act based on arguments and reasons. Well, what else would we do? Well, if you look at very ancient literature and cultures, it's all about what the ancestors did or what the gods did. Reasoning by example, copying good examples of good ancestors and good deities, and not copying what the bad guys did. Reasoning by example. At least in the Western tradition, only about 2,500 years ago do we see people trying to decide how to act based on internally consistent connections, what we call reason. So for the vast majority of human history and pre-human animal history, people were doing something else. And that is still with us today. It's called emotions, and they certainly affect us. And even if we get to the point where we're not swayed by emotions, or even don't have them at all, we still have to interact with other people who do make their decisions based on knee-jerk emotions and are more swayed by those things. Know your enemy and know yourself. So we've got to analyze what emotions are. A bit of a theme in this course. He says that something's bad, don't do it. Let's analyze the bad thing, figure out exactly how it works, and decide whether or not it really is bad. I could be lying a lot. For all you know, maybe I'm just a dreaming butterfly. So what is an emotion? So the psychologists have a field day with that. That's almost as bad as asking what is truth. Stack of books gets taller. But basically, the answers boil down to three things. Changes in physiology, behavior, and cognition. People tend to cry mostly when they're sad. You see some behavior. Physiology, if you're angry, your blood pressure will probably rise. Change in physiology. But we're not behavioral psychologists going to be measuring people's blood pressure all the time. The one that's useful for us is changes in cognition. So we'll look at the cognitive aspect of emotions. They have two subcomponents: an intentional object and a rating. Let's say if you're sad for no reason at all, sad about nothing, that's called depression. That's a disease. If you're emotional for no reason at all, that's something else. Generally, emotions have objects. Some event made you sad. Like, let's say you're upset that someone cut in front of you while driving. Then you only get upset when something actually happens. Someone cut in front of you while driving. That driver is the object of your intention. Intentional object, the thing your emotions caused by and pointed at. And then there's also a rating. Are you thankful and happy at that other driver? Well, probably not. It's probably a very negative value judgment attached to that. Either that person in general, they're a bad character who would do such a thing, or a negative value judgment on that behavior. Well, he should have used his turn signal. So, emotions need to have a cause, an intentional object, and a rating. The simplest rating scheme is one-dimensional, positive and negative. Chances are, really, emotions are a bit more complicated. Anger, guilt, shame, depression, grief, anxiety, jealousy, pity. That's a lot more than two things. We might need some more dimensions. And technically, that's just some negative emotions. What about positive? Neutral? Weird? There could be a lot of dimensions to emotions, and quantifying them is hard. There are some psychologists who actually try to do it, but it's beyond the scope of our stuff. Because we're practical, we're lazy. If it's hard, you better give us a good reason for doing it. For our purposes, it's probably enough to know that emotions consist of intentional objects and ratings of that object. And they also involve syllogisms. Emotions tend to affect behavior. I'm scared of this place, therefore I think I should get out of this place, leave this place. Emotions are sort of like arguments, a very vague, primitive version of an argument. And a new conclusion that's reached should change your behavior. Oh, that's a new conclusion. Let's do something else. So the intention and rating of an emotion tends to result in a behavior. However, sometimes the premises aren't true, sometimes the syllogisms aren't valid, and so emotions demand some troubleshooting and some scrutiny. Like, let's say you have a presentation in class and you're worried that you'll mess up. and then if you mess up, people will laugh at you and you'll be embarrassed. You'd probably be feeling anxiety. And that feeling is related to pretty much a whole series of steps, almost an argument. If I have a presentation, and I do have a presentation, I might probably mess up. If I mess up, people will laugh at me. If people laugh at me, I've made a fool of myself, and that's a very bad thing. About a lot of if-then statements. And the last line is, and that's a bad thing. Hence the feeling of anxiety. Whereas if you were at a comedy club, and then the second to last line is, and then everyone starts laughing, that would probably be a good thing. You'd have a different emotion than anxiety if you're imagining people laughing. Happiness, success. However, should you be that anxious about the presentation? And maybe even skip class so that you can avoid the presentation? That would be a behavior based on that emotion of anxiety. Maybe. It's possible. It would probably be maladaptive. You'd probably also feel some anxiety when your teacher gives you a 0 for that assignment. So what one would need to do is logic-based stress management. Pick apart the premises that lead to the anxiety. Am I gonna mess up tomorrow? Maybe you're really competent and you're just not gonna mess up at all. Would people laugh at you if you do mess up? Like, maybe there's just a huge list of presentations, we're trying to get through the whole class and everyone's bored to tears and they're not even listening, and you could mess up quite a bit and everyone's asleep already and they just don't even notice. If they did notice you mess up, would it be significant? Maybe everyone's messing up. And then either everyone thinks everyone's an idiot, or no one thinks anyone's all that bad for messing up. Emotions tend to be generated very quickly as jumps straight to the first plausible conclusion. Uncritical thinking. And a lot of the time, the emotion that we have and the emotions that we like to have are not the same thing. So we need to do a lot of repair work and troubleshooting, applying logic and then willpower and repetition to troubleshoot emotions. Decide whether, hey, is this truly a dangerous situation and I should run from that lion that's getting closer and closer? Or is it, my anxiety about that presentation was ill-founded for these several reasons. If nothing else, critical thinking might help us lead slightly happier or slightly more pleasant lives. Like cognitive behavioral therapy is the formal psychology term for that. And it's one major application of critical thinking that's useful even if you're not debating a separate human being, but just applying critical thinking in your own head. Hopefully my course is useful for some people. Yeah, see you.